Hey, everybody, welcome to BDE. In the second greatest trade in the history of all mankind, we were able to trade Kirk for the total upgrade at power forward Dave Purcell. How cool is that?
Well, thanks. I'm glad to be
Not
here.
only are you a better, you're a better player, better in the locker room, much better looking. It's all good. This is so great. So, Dave, where were you last?
So last at Apache.
Okay.
And
what were you doing at Apache?
So I was executive vice president of development. So at that point, kind of all the global assets reported up through me. So think of that as kind of global capital allocation directing.
Gotcha. What else? What other stops do you have in your career?
Yeah, so started out of school, Alaska for a few years, and worked for Steve Holditch in College Station for almost a decade doing hydraulic fracturing back before hydraulic fracturing was cool.
Glorified acid jobs.
That's right, yeah. And well, we were doing the large hydraulic ones back then. They were the first big ones. And then Pickering hired me to go to Simmons & Company for a few years, and then we spun out of Simmons and started Pickering Energy Partners, and then that became Tudor Pickering, and then I guess 5 or 6 years ago I moved over to Apache, and now I'm working on my farm and probably going to teach a little bit up at A&M. So
now, was that deliberate that you left Holt off Tudor Pickering?
well, you know,
don't worry, Maynard doesn't listen to this. Arjun will listen to this, but not Maynard. So I'm just kidding. You know, I went to Rice with Maynard.
Really?
Yeah. So I've known Maynard forever. If you forced me to find it, I can go find a picture of Maynard in short shorts, like really short shorts, throwing a keg of beer.
So it's like NBA Finals 1972 kind of shorts?
Totally.
Yeah. All right.
Exactly.
We've got to have that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Kind of like that. NFL pants today.
Yeah.
Exactly. All right, Mark, you want to kick us off?
Well, got another event this week. Maybe you.
Oh, yeah. I'll
few
do
words.
This. So if you listened to Chuck Yates's job last week, you know that Wednesday, November 13th is the YDC roast. We do it every year. YDC, near and dear to my heart. I've been on the board there for over 20 years. It's an after-school literacy program. We say it serves Houston's Fifth Ward. It's really a little bit more north of Fifth Ward, but that's Houston's roughest and tumblest neighborhood. And YDC, we do an amazing job getting kids through the program. If they'll spend a year in our program, they'll increase reading and comprehension scores by 2.5 type grade levels. And the roast basically funds the organization for the year. So we've done, I think this is our 18th roast. Men of the Hour have included Ken Hirsch, Will Van Lowe, Mike Lynn, Lisa Stewart.
The Rice Brothers.
The Rice Brothers last year. Brian Sheffield. I got roasted one year and wound up with a tattoo on my rear end. So it's a lot of fun. It's Wednesday night. I will literally sell you a ticket if you show up or I will sell you a table if you show up at the door that night. So anyway,
it's a great
looking
event.
forward to it. And this year, the man of the hour is John Jacoby. And the word on the street is that Doug Brooks is going to crush it as a roaster. So
it's an important day as well, 11/11. Happy Veterans Day. Big salute to everyone who has served and is serving. And I don't see the poppy.
Calling me out. I can't find the poppy. You didn't have to call me out on that. It's also Remembrance Day.
Remembrance Day.
Remembrance Day in UK. One of the running things is we talk about the British girlfriend on BDE.
Oh,
and so,
gotcha.
Yeah, she gave me a poppy, and now I'm in trouble because Mark called me out.
Well, I am her favorite host. So.
Yes, I know. Horrible.
At least last I heard.
But no, really amazing everyone who has served. The world is a much better place because of the efforts of the U.S. and British soldiers throughout the years.
So we had a special last week, and I think we signed off with the expectation that we weren't going to see any kind of definitive result just based on recent trends. I'm talking about the U.S. election. But lo and behold, here we are 6-7 days later, and we seem to have a lot of behind the scenes action going on and a lot of speculation in the press about what this all means for a lot of things, but important to us, energy, and more specifically, oil markets and the U.S. upstream. And so one of the things that Dave failed to mention, and I had the privilege and the advantage of working as an equity analyst covering the E&P sector, a big part of his role in research was turning very deep hydraulic fracturing and reservoir engineering knowledge into really a macro franchise, covering oil and gas markets for 20 years almost. Yep. You also had a fundamentals group at Apache as well. And so I thought it would be good to touch on, the various elements of the policy things that we're seeing, what's coming, and importantly, just give us your thoughts on maybe a couple of things. What is OPEC thinking and doing here? And then having recently been part of significant E&P budget preparation, tis the season where that all kicks off. What should we be thinking about and looking for?
And Mark and I will shut up for the next 30 minutes.
Well, no. So please don't let me ramble.
Please ramble.
I think there's a lot to unpack there. So I think budgets, we'll come back to that, because I think ultimately when you're setting a budget for next year, and prices are soft and there's a lot of uncertainty, it drives you to being more conservative as opposed to more aggressive. And I think there's a lot of uncertainty as to how this is all going to play out. So when I think about OPEC, I think it's really, there's a lot of moving parts, but I think so I'm going to simplify it into the Trump administration put some real strong sanctions on Iran. And these are sanctions with teeth. So what does that mean? Say 1.5 million barrels a day of oil comes off the market. Saudis, so that should make prices go up, except Saudi's ready to open up, and they're producing 9 today. That'll put them at 10.5. They're capable of 10.5. I'm not sure I believe the 12 million barrels a day of sustainable capacity.
So directionally, they are 1.5 million of the 2.2 kind of nameplate. That's part of the cuts that were set for restoration beginning now, which they've kicked the can down the road at least a month.
Yeah. So if you think about the Iran sanctions, and let's assume that happens, Saudi comes in for the lion's share, and other countries, come in for bits and pieces. Probably the Emirates are the next biggest piece of spare capacity. And so that's a push, but I think that also, if you're putting Iran in a corner, then that drives more pragmatic peace discussions with Hamas and Hezbollah, because their benefactor just got put in timeout. And you have a scenario where you could actually get some sort of a peace deal done. If you can it's just kind of like the cutting horse analogy. You move Iran over here, and then the real players have to sit down and have discussions. So and there's a lot of things could happen differently, but in that scenario, crude is likely lower, not higher, because the risk premium goes away. Overall supply and demand balance doesn't change, but the risk is starting to taper off.
Yeah, we haven't seen normal risk premium reaction to any geopolitical event for at least 10 years.
Yeah, it's kind of one of those things people talk about, and I'm not sure, I agree with you, Mark. I'm not sure how much is actually in the price. But when I look at the price today, the forward curves in backwardation, that tells you markets are tight. There's nothing loose about the current global supply and demand market based on all the inventory numbers you see and based on the price structure. And those are positive things. I don't think you're going to see OPEC wildly increase production. But I think what we just talked about, or I just laid out, doesn't happen in 4 weeks, right? That's probably something that takes the first half of next year to unfold, and there's your uncertainty.
Yeah.
And this is born of ignorance. This question is and it may be too much political rhetoric, but it did feel like last time Trump really was able to be somewhat effective on the sanctions on Iran. I mean, that there were barrels sneaking across Iraq that were being sold and stuff, but for the most part, it felt like is Iran. Shouldn't they have predicted that Trump is potentially going to win and we're going to go back to that regime? And are they potentially going to be more effective getting their barrels out? And I don't know if that's selling to China or whatever. Do you think we can actually put them in timeout?
I think we can, because if you look, Iran doesn't have 10 different export points. They've basically got one, and it's easy to monitor.
Yeah.
I think what you have to do is not just penalize Iran, but penalize anybody who takes those barrels. So again, it's not perfect, right? You'll get some leakage, but I think if you look before, I think they were pretty effective, and I think you'll have the support of the other countries in the Middle East, having spent some time over there. I think there was a lot of concern around lifting sanctions on Iran, both under the Obama administration and then Biden, because it gives them cash and it frees them up to do bad things.
Yeah.
And I think
which has been what's kept the momentum behind the Russian economy with the sanctions. They've just not been effective. You know, the best retaliation in that scenario is you flood the market, and a heavily producer-oriented economy can't continue to be robust and fund the war machine.
Right. That's actually the other leverage you have on that conflict against the Russians is exactly that, is try to impact that revenue stream. So I think there'll be a lot of regional support for stronger sanctions on Iran, and I think it could be effective.
So bringing in the notion of the campaign theme that we've heard for several months of drill, baby, drill, despite the fact that, you know, we've pointed out in the industry in higher profile voices have been saying, look, we're not inclined to behave any differently relative to what we've been through the last 5 to 10 years, which is we're going to be very disciplined. You know, we've, as a component of the S&P, we've flirted or dallied with irrelevance in terms of the weighting in the market. And yet, despite the fact that you've seen discipline indicated by declining rig count over the last couple of years, we've got, for a number of reasons we've discussed, we don't need to get into today, we've got, I think, surprisingly buoyant U.S. production. How does OPEC view that particular element? Because in the past, it's been, 2014 and then 2020, it's been more of a market share threat. And I guess the question is that part of the calculus here with OPEC, if they start to see some more aggressive signs out of the U.S. producer base, is there more of an inclination to maybe bring barrels back faster?
Yeah, I think OPEC is looking at unconventional from a position of knowledge today. I think 6, 7, 8 years ago, they had no idea. And I was at an OPEC meeting.
None of us did.
Yeah, and I was at an OPEC meeting, and had dinner with the Kuwaiti delegation, and all they wanted to talk about, they reached out to me, and all they wanted to talk about was unconventional, and it was clear it was important to them, and they didn't understand any of it. It was, to the degree it was a mystery to us, it was order of magnitude more of a mystery to them. I think they've gotten smarter about it. They're smart people. They're doing some unconventional development over in the region as well. I think they look at the growth rate, and I don't think the growth rate out of the U.S. scares them. Now, if it accelerates, if you got 1 million barrels a day or over 1 million barrels a day year-on-year growth out of the U.S., I think that would change, but I don't think that's going to happen. So as long as we continue to see those growth rates start to diminish and U.S. production plateau, and I would argue, given the current price, $70 TI, 68, thank you. With some uncertainty, I suspect budgets are probably lower
in 25
on the margin. Consolidation helps with reduced activity, tamper activity, and then price will. So I don't think OPEC's going to be. I mean, they're going to continue to watch U.S. production, but I don't think anything they see today is going to scare them.
Okay, so I'm going to be the delegation taking you to dinner now. It felt like back in 2017 when I was sitting at Kane, all we were doing was dialing fracs back to see, can we save a little bit of money? What does it do to performance? And the rig rate keeps falling, but production keeps growing. Did we continue to just get better at this? I don't. How are we still going up?
The answer is, it's a great question. The answer is yes. I think a lot of people were looking at numbers and saying, well, production should have already peaked or plateaued. I think well performance, per well metrics, you're starting to see that they're not declining, but starting to plateau. But I think it's longer laterals, and you can cut rig count by a bunch, but it's how many lateral feet are you drilling and fracking? And, the experience we had at Apache, and it's in the public domain, so nothing, I'm not speaking out of school here, was in a lot of areas, wider spacing and bigger fracs. It was kind of contrary to what folks were looking at in 2017, 2018. And the idea is, there's that balance, how do you, again, it's how do you maximize your economic returns? The real, I was up at A&M on Friday, and one of the challenges that we talked about was we're still only getting 6 or 7% recovery. So we're making great wells, but we're not doing a very good job of reservoir engineering in aggregate recovery. And remember, typically you'll recover 30, 40, 50% of the oil in place. So there's a lot to do over time, but it's not going to grow production.
And it was one of the feature parts of the rationale that Exxon talked about during the Pioneer transaction, or the announcement of that, was, alluding to, I think there was even a number on it, maybe doubling recovery factors.
Yeah.
A combination of 4 mile versus 2 mile laterals. But it was more than that. Just in terms of the ability to, you put a couple of percentage points increments on that, you're talking about a lot of recovery factor.
So I think you just explained it for me, because back at Kane, we were early stage assets, right? Mm-hmm. We would drill the first horizontal well in a county. We'd do the first slick water frac somewhere. And what's interesting about that mindset is you sit down with management team, and if you have an operational engineer in the room, they want to optimize stuff. And you're like, no. Let's hit that rock with everything we can so we can figure out what it actually will do. We'll optimize later. And so in 2019, we spent $931 million just on D&C capital. There was some acreage in there, but not much. We had bought all our stuff. And at the end of the year, looking through our reserves, we had drilled, I think it was a 32% rate of return, which normally you'd think is great. Given what we paid for acreage, we probably needed to drill about 40 or 45. So the reason I'm sitting here and not still in a job is because of that. But what we found out trying to figure out spacing was it was the opposite mindset. Instead of let's hit it with everything we got, we were finding if we put too many wells in certain formations, you didn't just overspend to get it out. You didn't get the milkshake out. You had too many straws in there. Something was going on in the reservoir. So we actually, during that year, learned that if you think spacing is going to be 8 wells, do 4. And then you can do 6 the next time if you see the results.
There's a few high-profile public examples of that, which unfortunately, put the aggressive downspacing under, or well spacing under a spotlight. But you can turn around and spend, I don't know, on a multi-layer, multi-well pad, you can spend $200 million before you know you've got a problem. And I think the industry's moved pretty far down the road with that recognition. Unfortunately, at least then you had to drill it and test it before you knew you had a problem.
Well, this is, again, I'm gonna geek out here for a brief moment.
Geek.
This is where what I believe happens is when you over drill and over complete, you're basically getting you're pressure depleting right away, and you're getting the entire layer below the bubble point immediately, which will lower recovery. Because it's not intuitive. It's like, well, if I drill 8 wells instead of 6, I should at least get the same amount of recovery. I shouldn't reduce recovery. I just overspent. But there's a real small window between optimal well spacing and too much. And one of the challenges companies got in was they'd have a well count target. So we're going to have 1,500 wells that are economic. Well, you're stuck, because if you start to downspace and say, well, I need four wells instead of 6, I only have 1,000 locations. Well, I can't tell the street that. Well, you should, but there's a reluctance to tell the street that. So you kind of continue on this, well, maybe we'll do 5. And it's a anchor that prevents you from doing what's right as quickly as you should. That's where well count, anybody puts a well count out there should probably be dismissed right away. Well, because they don't know.
Yeah. Didn't the market come out basically and say, hey, at 3 or 4 times cash flow, we don't care what your well count is? I mean, I think, did that happen, or was I being too rational?
Well, I mean, Mark's the stock guy here, but when you get away from net asset value and you start to look at more cash flow multiples, then well count becomes almost irrelevant.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah.
And we went through a bit of a pendulum swing back and forth on that as well, being back more toward net asset value, at least fundamentally, with what we witnessed in what I was just talking about, where you spent $200 million on a development in a section where, the drag on a program's returns is pretty severe. And that ultimately translates into what cash flow multiple the street is ultimately going to assign you. So it's not mutually exclusive, right? So I think, this is a bit of ancient history, but I think in terms of kind of back to the here and now and looking ahead, the drill baby drill, I guess, rally charge is, just from a practical standpoint, because of the structure of the U.S. oil and gas industry, a bunch of private actors out there doing things for their own priorities and their own stakeholders, unless there's some wild incentive that comes into the formula, we're where we should be relative to the equilibrium, or we're closer to the equilibrium in terms of how the U.S. producer group is behaving. And I saw a clip or a quote from one of, I think it was in the summer, a North Carolina campaign stop. And, basically Trump was saying that we're going to make this happen. And if it crushes the oil and gas companies, I don't care. that's just, that just from a practical standpoint, it's not really a threat.
Well, I think consolidation helps create less of a frenetic environment. But it also helps you drill better wells because you put all this acreage under better operators. The buyer ought to be a better operator than the seller, and they'll reallocate capital to where the best wells are. So that's where you can see, again, maybe a bit more runway on the well improvements. And I think you'll see that. But on the drill baby drill, that's federal acreage.
Right.
And you're talking Gulf of Mexico, parts of New Mexico, and Alaska. And only one of those is short cycle.
Right.
And so would I make a long cycle bet? And there's actually, the answer is no. Would you make a long cycle bet where 4 years from now, you don't know if that policy is going to be switched when the next regime comes in with different policies? And so, it's basically a New Mexico part of the Permian where you might see some movement, but I think it's campaign rhetoric and not reality, but I don't know.
Mark and I talked the pre-election show, what was that, 3 weeks ago? I almost look at it more as it's not drill baby drill, it's more if you want energy expansion so we can do AI and all that sort of stuff, it's going to be us because we're going to put in rules in place that allow you to, lay a line here and do that. So it's more a binary. It's not necessarily going to be a cost type thing. So did either one of y'all ever interact with Governor Burgum? Because they're talking that he's the dude. He's going to be energy czar.
Well, yeah, not energy secretary. In fact, he would have been a good participant in the energy draft. So it's actually going to become a real thing. Energy czar.
Energy czar.
And the way I look at it is, I think there's two. He's been the dominant name that's rumored to take on this role. Trump just named his border czar. But it would be a multi-agency purview that would include DOE, Interior, FERC, and the EPA. I'm hoping that they can somehow maneuver the NRC in there, but it's really an umbrella authority over all the various agencies that are doing the things that are the impediments to more accelerated development, particularly in BLM and in federal land. And along with those things, rollbacks or cancellations of the temporary LNG pause. There was quite a bit of expanded federal monument designation, particularly in Alaska. We talked about that with the mining situation up there, and then cutting back the NPRA leasable acreage. So this is, I'm not sure how the authority works outside of a formal cabinet post. It's really, the way I look at it, it's in effect a replacement to the Biden administration's notion of a climate czar, the most famous of which was John Kerry.
Yeah.
But you've got to have some coordinating mechanism from an executive standpoint to be able to get these reforms and rollbacks done in parallel, and I think that's the concept or the notion.
Well,
it's going to make for some interesting politics.
Well, I think what you saw in the first Trump administration, if you talk to folks on the ground, they saw less bureaucracy around permitting.
Right.
And it wasn't necessarily, to your point, Chuck, it wasn't necessarily drilling permitting. It was, we got to lay a line across some federal acreage. There's just a lot that the government's involved with. And the folks on the ground felt like when the Trump administration came in, it wasn't like, well, go do what you want to do. It was, okay, we can help you. You still have to do the permits. You still have to do it right. But there was less purposeful bureaucracy getting in the way to slow things down. It was a smoother process. And that's what this feels like it could be. And then you throw an energy czar to try to try to regulate, or not regulate, but try to get all the different players talking again to help create a smoother glide path. I think particularly on some of the power generation challenges we're going to have around data centers, and there's a lot of opportunity there.
Well, midstream infrastructure, nukes, LNG, et cetera, I think are the real potential areas of impact. I think, as you pointed out, risk-taking on long-cycle projects is not going to change, and BLM land is not the dominant priority for oil and gas activity. I just looked at the Permian. There's not a tremendous amount of federal land out there. And so I think to the extent that we can accelerate things, and maybe it manifests in the form of the Energy Permitting Reform Act that came out of the Senate, the Manchin-Barrasso bill, which amazingly is only 75 pages long and addresses these types of kind of time deadlines on some of the regulatory action or comment. But it is more midstream and downstream, or downstream of producing facilities and assets themselves. In my mind, the rest of it's fun to talk about, but I don't know that it changes upstream behavior all that much, even over the next 5 to 10 years.
I am feeling a little bit needy and sad that my name hasn't been floated as the energy czar.
Well, I was gonna throw it out there with.
You need a podcaster.
Yeah,
you're gonna be the Matthew McConaughey. What is he? The Minister of Culture at UT. That's you're gonna be the Minister of Pop Culture.
I could go be. I'll Governor Burgum. Happy to serve as your press secretary. Those would be fun press conferences.
Speaking of climate czars,
knock us out on COP.
Well, we've got, if you're paying any attention, we kicked off the COP29 or COP29 in Baku this week, and it caught my attention. It kind of sneaks up on you now. There was a tweet over the weekend about and we'll attach it here, and I'm going to butcher her name, but Tracy Schuchert, known as at Chai Girl, made a list of non-attendees. Some of these are last-minute cancellations. Some were unresponsive, but it includes, naturally, President Biden, President Xi of China is not attending, no reason given. And surprisingly, EU President Ursula von der Leyen is not attending, but because she needs to prepare for her second term in office. Olaf Scholz, who's potentially facing a no confidence vote as early as January in Germany, won't be attending. And also surprisingly, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is not attending. And there was a Bloomberg piece that came out talking about really the angst that has beset COP29 about really the cash grab. Thinking coming out of COP28, we were, looking to accelerate that $100 billion fund that the attendees or the parties to COP had from the West were, at least on paper, committed to fund their pro rata share. That's, as I recall, has been lagging. And now, the conversation since the last conference of the parties has shifted into it. No, it's not $100 billion. It needs to start with a T. And now you've got this cross thread, if you will, of Trump coming back into office, which has been a flurry of announcements or indications that we're going to do things like pull out of Paris, we'll pull out of COP unilaterally. And so what does it all mean? Well, if you lose arguably what would be the largest contributor to transition funding for developing countries, it's a real conundrum. And
so Dave, I want to get your take on this, but I do want to share this story real quick. The thing I love about sitting here hanging out with other old guys, y'all remember Sun City in South Africa, right?
Yeah.
It's this big fancy resort, and they were just paying ridiculous amounts. But this was under the time of apartheid. Mandela's still in jail. And basically all the artists gathered together and said, we're not going to play Sun City. And they made a song about it that I think Little Steven actually wrote the song. Bruce Springsteen's in it. And they had this big press conference. Ironically enough, I think they did it at the Plaza Hotel, having this press conference. And my friend T. Sean Shannon, who's a stand-up comedian and ultimately did write for Saturday Night Live, win an Emmy and stuff. Back then, he was literally a struggling stand-up comedian. He showed up to it and told the guard, well, I need to be in there. I've pledged not to play Sun City. And somehow made it on stage with all these guys just by talking to himself. Well, of course, I'm noted comedian T. Sean Shannon. And you can see him actually in the video. I mean, it's a flash. So just for the record, I'm not going to COP29.
So I actually attended COP27. And
where was that one?
It was in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. And because Apache is the largest U.S. investor in Egypt and the largest oil producer onshore Egypt, the government asked Apache to participate. So I went and I was uncharacteristically quiet. I was kind of a fly on the wall. A couple of things that are really interesting about COP, if you'll indulge me.
Please.
It is a secure environment. There's a blue zone and a green zone, and it's kind of like a bullseye target. So the farther in you go, the more security clearance you have to have. And to get into the main conference is a lot of security. You got to have letters, and you go through like 2 levels of airport security, and it's really crazy. And we come out of security, we go into the main plaza, and it's like any conference. There's breakfast and dinners going on outside, but the main meetings are going on during the day. And you go through all this security and you come out, and there's protesters. It's like, how did these protesters get through this wall of security? It's wild. I mean, they're chanting, end of fossil fuels or whatever, and they got this big mural in the background. So a couple hours later, we're walking back through the same area, and there's all these people milling around with their signs on the ground, and it's a different group of folks. And the press is getting set up, and there's a guy with a bullhorn. Protest starts in 2 minutes. 2 minutes to protest. It's like, you got to schedule the protests. So you got to get approved for what kind of protest you're going to do. So it's a highly kind of choreographed set of meetings. But what they did, because it was on the continent of Africa and it was developing countries, there was a different vibe there. And the term energy imperialism was used. Now, this is 2 years ago. Europe's paying all kinds of crazy prices for gas, natural gas, because of the Russian-Ukraine thing. And they're telling Africa, look, you send us all your gas and you guys just go straight to wind and solar. And the African countries, they weren't having it. And the Kenyan oil minister, I think it was Kenya, they had a big project coming online, and she was asked by this, she was on a panel, and she was asked about it. And she said, look, make no mistake, we're going to develop this the right way, but we are using this project to bring our brothers and sisters in sub-Saharan Africa out of energy poverty. And she used that term 4 or 5 times, and the moderator did not ask her another question. Because one, that woman had more presence than anybody I've ever been around. She was awesome, and it's true that, and it goes back to the challenge. This is a whole topic in and of itself. But when you have 2 billion people who live in energy poverty, what goes on at COP28, COP29 it has no relevance to those people. How are we going to get those people out of energy poverty? And we're not going to do it by whatever they're trying to sell at COP27, COP28, COP29.
It's basically let them eat cake.
It is.
I mean, it is. And wars get started over a lot less than this.
Yeah,
So,
and I think one of the more nefarious efforts to force the issue by the developed world has been mainly related to the threats of restricting or eliminating financing. I spoke with someone, you and I both used to work with, a Nigerian native, and he lives in the UK, but he was making frequent trips back home. And, their solution, and we've talked about the Nigerian grid collapse that had its sixth total collapse just a few weeks ago, is everybody who can afford it has got diesel backup generation, which is very expensive. And the whole mindset is oriented toward moving as far away from energy poverty as I can. And you're not going to dictate that to me. And, presidents and national leaders of these sovereign nations know that the first way to political instability, and sometimes ending in violence, is one, deprive the people, or two, price them out of the ability to afford the basics, which include power and the energy that you need to actually get things done, and actually live a reasonably reasonably above the subsistence level of day-to-day life. So I think we're reaching that. And I recall that shift started to occur, and you heard more from the leaders in the global South talk about the very issue of, look, it's about energy poverty first, and everything else comes behind that. That's an immovable priority that we can't be forced to change.
Yeah, Scott Tinker he used to run BEG, and he runs, I don't know what the name of his group is, but he
Switch
talks
Energy Alliance.
He talks very articulately with a lot of fact-based discussion around this energy poverty issue, and that's the challenge, not what's going on in Baku. In my mind,
Chuck did a special with Scott 3 or 4 weeks ago.
Maybe a little longer than that, a couple of months ago. But one point Scott emphasizes, and he says we can't be shy emphasizing, is we can't even deal with the carbon issue until everybody's rich, as we quote unquote define rich, making more than $30,000 a year or whatever it is. He said, we just don't have the wherewithal to do it. And so that's really important.
Speaking of energy abundance, Diamondback, who's been a pretty progressive force, I think, for the U.S. upstream industry, recall that earlier this year they announced a memorandum of understanding with Oklo to develop SMRs for off-grid power use. I think up to 50 megawatts. And earlier this summer, it began talking about bringing natural gas into the discussion. The notion of, essentially giving away gas for free in the Permian has proven to be a vexing problem. And there was a piece out featuring, I think, what they said during their earnings call last week, more specifically related to, okay, let's entertain the notion of all of this data center demand that's coming, and look at using our natural gas resources to generate power, not only for our own use to decarbonize our operations, make more things like electric based, take pressure off the grid. But, we were talking before the show started about, what that looks like from an infrastructure standpoint. And, do you see a data center hub start to develop at pace in the Permian? They said specifically, we've got 65,000 acres of land that we're certainly willing and ready to use to host data center customers, if you will, for off-grid power. And, I don't know if Waha is going to be zero forever, but it's, in light of the GOR discussion and what we're seeing with ever rising GORs in the Permian and the need to build egress every time a new development comes around. What do you do with all the gas? Makes sense. So,
yeah, I think what Mark's alluding to on the gas oil ratio is in the Southern Midland Basin. It was probably 2016. There was this whole kerfuffle around gas oil ratios increasing. Well, they should in tight rock. But there was this notion that it would actually plateau. So this is how much gas is being produced by an individual well relative to the amount of oil. And it hasn't. It continues to increase, and it's going asymptotic. So a well starts out producing 3,000 cubic feet of gas per barrel of oil. That well today might be producing, 4 or 5 years down the road, 60 to 70,000 cubic feet per barrel. And it continues to rise. And so until you understand the reservoir physics, forecasting GOR and forecasting gas production from the basin, people are going to continually underestimate, which means you're always going to be chasing your tail from a basin evacuation standpoint.
And I remember having a call with a client, a veteran energy dedicated client, around the GOR kerfuffle, and I think 2016 was the right time frame. But the remedial, almost completely ignorant understanding or grasp of what this critical factor is it's something that you're not going to be able to change. It is a feature of Permian oil and tight rock production, which I think creates tremendous opportunity to the extent that you can align things like, okay, we want to spot more off-grid gas-fired generation, which then leads to a conversation about, well, what does that mean for emissions? And we're in this, what I consider to be a gap period between an avalanche of demand that needs power yesterday, data centers, and there's a lot of price insensitivity around that, and nuclear, which seems to have caught kind of bipartisan tailwind here. What fills the gap? Is anybody going to come around and say, well, we're going to spot a grid scale or base load coal-fired facility? I don't think that's going to happen.
So I will volunteer two things to my dear friend Case Van Hoff. Number one, and we've talked about this a lot, and this is tongue-in-cheek that we talk about a lot, but I seriously think you need to go to Silicon Valley and go sit down with Google. You need to sit down with Microsoft. I guess that's Redmond. But you actually need to talk to these end users because they are wildly ignorant on what natural gas can do. They truly just think, well, it's a polluting hydrocarbon. So we got to go educate them. So I'm happy to go along on that trip and help facilitate those discussions, because I think it would just be total baller to hang out with Case Van Hoff in California. I know he's a SoCal guy, but we'll go do NoCal. And then second, I will go to Monahans, Texas, and upgrade the food scene so that the data center manager doesn't have to eat at that freaking Bennigan's every night. Okay. We'll put in a good restaurant and get a steak, maybe some sushi, something, but I will do that. That will be my contribution to, because every AI data center, so AI is going to break down into really time sensitive type things. If you're in a hospital and an alarm system, that's going to be time sensitive, and the data center is going to need to be nearby. But there's a whole host of just training models and stuff that isn't that time sensitive. All of that crap ought to be out in West Texas, where the gas is, where you can get solar,
where the free gas is,
you can get solar. Because my understanding is running the computer lines is nothing. They'll run those 200 and 300 miles, and that's no big deal. And you got enough of that stuff in Dallas. you can get it out to Midland. So
yeah, you could ultimately connect it, and I think that will happen. And I think it's easy to show gas versus nuclear when you're trying to reactivate 3 Mile Island versus building some gas-fired power, which is quicker and easier and has more certainty around it. I'm going the gas route, no question.
But it's not going to happen unless Case and Toby and all these guys, and I say this with love, unless you guys get on a plane and go sit down with these folks, it's not going to happen. We cannot depend on the utilities to do this because these guys just don't have the mindset.
Yeah, and hopefully the shift in the political landscape is positive for that, that acceleration, that momentum. And, there are examples of certain companies and their leaders providing industry leadership on. So
last question, just real quick. What in the heck are you Aggies doing putting nukes on campus? I'm kind of fired up by this.
We already have a nuclear.
Have one.
We have a reactor on campus.
We have a 1 megawatt reactor out by the airport, Easterwood Airport.
Yeah, it's been there for a long time.
Really?
This is nothing new. In fact, one of the reasons, so Bill von Gonten, when he started his lab, he had it up at A&M because turns out if you're an academic institution, it's easier to get nuclear permits. And a lot of the lab equipment has some nuclear, small, it's not a nuclear reactor, but it's got some nuclear bits to it. And so you probably have, A&M is land rich compared to the sister school in Austin. And this Rellis campus that people talk about where they're talking about this facility is an old Air Force base.
Yeah, it's up in Bryan.
I mean, A&M is land rich. It's amazing. When you talk to people, where are you? It's like, A&M goes almost all the way out west to the Brazos River.
Yeah.
And so there's plenty of land to put it there. And again, there's already a nuclear reactor on campus. So.
Largest nuclear engineering program in the world as well. And this really touches on something that we've talked about in the last couple of weeks, like the bee problem that Zuckerberg has. And really spotting from a land standpoint, how do you control that or provide access? And it's got to be, it's got to be permittable to spot these facilities. And so, those that have the land, like Diamondback, 65,000 acres for SMRs and off-grid gas-fired generation, that's pretty straightforward. You can get those things built. In other areas where land and fuel are problematic from either a NIMBY or a permitting standpoint, that's what these players are telling you out front, that, bring it here. And so I think maybe this breaks a little bit of a logjam. There might be some other players that come out of the woodwork that do have the real estate to be able to get this done, to not necessarily bypass the permitting process, but it's a heck of a lot more straightforward to do so.
If your band could glow in the dark too, that would be total baller. That would be like the greatest ever. All right, Dave, close us out. Take it anywhere you want to go. Thoughts, funny story, serious, whatever you want to do. And please promise us you'll come back on.
Well, I'd love to come back. And I won't tell you funny stories because Maynard once told me that I was the no fun guy. He said, no, you sit over there. We'll tell you when we need you. We're talking fun here. So you sit in a corner. So, actually an interesting thing, this may be too geeky, so it probably hits the editing floor. But one of the conversations we were having on Friday around what research needs to be done in unconventionals. And it's actually a reservoir engineering research, because the question that was posed was, does anybody know if in a nanodarcy rock, how a molecule of gas gets from one end of this table to the other end? And the answer is no. That's why we have 5% recovery factor. So there is a lot to do in this space. It's really exciting.
You and Mark should literally do a podcast on that, because I would geek out on that
Yeah.
because half my partners at Kane were engineers, and they were really smart. And I always said their core competency was they could try something, measure it, document it, and compare it, but they had no idea why they were trying what they did.
Understanding phase behavior and relative permeability and nanodarcy rock it sounds geeky, but it's pretty cool to know.
Yeah, there's a lot of like capillarity and wettability that overtakes the Darcy. So it becomes a really interesting question. And when you pose that question to a room full of researchers and none of them say, "Oh yeah, I know how that works," they're like, you're onto something. So again, there's a lot to do in the Permian beyond kind of tier one inventory over time, but we're not going to worry about it. It won't grow production. It will just create a very shallow, long-lived decline curve. So
nothing cures low oil prices like low
oil
oil prices.
prices.
Nothing cures high oil prices like high oil prices. Everybody, everybody, appreciate you joining us. If you liked it, definitely comment. Put lots of comments on how much you enjoyed Dave, way more so than Kirk, and maybe we're going to be able to talk him into coming back on.